The sound was not loud. It was not the kind of sound that echoes like a gunshot or rattles glass. It was sharper, quieter, but it carried the weight of history. In a crowded courtroom in Tulare Springs, Texas, the air froze as Officer Bradley Kean raised his hand and struck Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett across the face. For a moment, the world stopped breathing. There were no cameras inside that room, but every soul present felt the slap as though it had cracked open something far greater than flesh. A gasp cut the silence. A pen rolled to the floor, and for 2 long seconds, no one dared to move. Then chaos. But amidst the uproar, Jasmine Crockett did not stumble. She did not cry. She lifted her head, her voice steady, and declared, "He doesn't get to silence me." That moment was not just about one officer losing control. It was not simply the collapse of a man once hailed as a hero in a small town. It was the unmasking of a system that had been sick for far too long, a system that had written its own stories, hidden its own sins, and punished anyone who dared to speak. The slap was a rupture, but also a revelation. And so the question must be asked. When a system that has protected injustice for decades finally exposes itself in the light, will we look away or will we answer? This is not just another courtroom story. It is the story of silence and of truth, of fear and of courage. It is the story of a black woman standing unflinching in the very place where justice should have always lived. And it is the story of how one act of violence, meant to humiliate, instead ignited a reckoning that spread far beyond the walls of Tulare Springs. For those who have lived through decades of struggle, for those who remember the marches, the songs, the chains, and the prayers, this story will feel familiar. It will echo the long history of black voices, demanding to be heard in a nation that too often tried to silence them. It will remind us that progress does not come as a gift, it comes as a demand written in sacrifice and sealed in courage. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood in that courtroom. As more than a witness, she stood as the daughter of ancestors who once carried the unbearable weight of being deemed less than human. She stood as the inheritor of a legacy forged by Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Shirley Chisholm, women who turned their very existence into a weapon of truth. And when her cheek bore the mark of that slap, it was not just her face that burned. It was the reminder of every bruise that had gone unseen, every voice that had been muted, every name forgotten. But Crockett did not fall. She chose to stand, to finish her testimony, to let the world know that no blow could erase the truth she had carried into that room. And in that choice, she gave us more than a story. She gave us a challenge. Stay with us. Because this isn't just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. A future where silence no longer protects the powerful, where dignity belongs, not to the privileged few, but to every child, every family, every community who dares to claim it. Tulare Springs, Texas, a small town, hidden between stretches of dry farmland and aging industrial zones. The population was barely over 17,000, but its silence was louder than any city of millions. It was the kind of place where tradition weighed heavy. Friday night football under floodlights, Sunday morning church bells echoing down Main Street, and an unspoken rule that when something went wrong, you kept quiet. That silence became part of the soil. It seeped into classrooms, into family gatherings, into the very breath of the town. If you were black or Latino, you learned it quickly. Do not make trouble. Do not raise your voice. And above all, do not question the men in blue uniforms who cruise the streets with flashing lights and tight jaws. Loyalty was the word people used. They said Tulare Springs was built on loyalty. Loyalty to God, loyalty to football, loyalty to police. But loyalty without accountability is not loyalty at all. It is fear dressed in Sunday clothes, behind closed doors. Stories circulated like smoke. A boy pulled from his car and searched without cause. A shop owner questioned until midnight for a missing receipt. A mother warned that if she filed a complaint, her son might be watched more closely on his way to school. For years, none of these stories reached the outside world because when people dared to speak, they were punished. Jobs disappeared. Tires were slashed. Anonymous phone calls rattled through the night. The system protected itself by making examples of anyone who resisted, and so, generation after generation, the silence continued. But silence never lasts forever. One evening, a 14-year-old boy named Darnell Freeman was riding his bicycle home after a shift at a grocery store. He had no weapon. He had done nothing wrong. But Officer Bradley Kean stopped him. The body camera footage, the footage that should have been buried like so many others, caught what followed. Kean shoved the boy to the ground, pressed his knee into his back, and twisted his arm until it broke. The boy's voice was thin, high, terrified. I didn't do anything. I wasn't resisting. Blood dripped from his lip. He cried for his mother. Normally, this would have disappeared. The file would have been locked away, labeled inconclusive, and filed under a mountain of forgotten complaints. But this time, fate intervened. The footage was accidentally uploaded to a public server, and once it slipped into daylight, the truth raced like wildfire. Within hours, the video was shared online. By the next morning, civil rights lawyers were booking flights to Texas. News vans lined the streets of Tulare Springs. Reporters shoved microphones at stunned residents, and suddenly, the whole country was looking at a town that had built its reputation on loyalty, silence, and the illusion of order. The officials panicked. They insisted the video did not tell the full story. They claimed Officer Kean had followed protocol, but outside Tulare Springs, people were not fooled. They had seen this story too many times before. They had seen George Floyd in Minneapolis. They had seen Rodney King in Los Angeles, and now they saw Darnell Freeman in Tulare Springs. The names changed. The towns changed. But the pattern was always the same. It was in this moment that Jasmine Crockett entered the story. She was not from Tulare Springs. She had no family there, no votes to win, no career to build in this small corner of Texas. But she saw the footage, and something inside her broke open. Later, she would say, there are moments when you do not get to choose. The moment chooses you. Maybe it was the way Darnell called for his mother, a sound no mother could ignore. Maybe it was the dead, mechanical expression on Kean's face, as though breaking a child's arm was just another line in his daily report. Whatever it was, Jasmine Crockett could not look away. She picked up the phone. She called the Freeman family. She drove to their small home, where fear and determination sat side by side at the kitchen table. She listened as Darnell described what had happened, his young voice trembling, but steady enough to repeat the truth. She watched his mother hold back tears, her hands clasped tight, as though prayer was the only thing keeping her together. And Crockett made a decision. She would not let this town bury another child's story. In the weeks that followed, she began to dig. She pulled records, demanded files, requested emails. She spoke to neighbors who had long remained silent, and slowly, one by one, they began to talk. She uncovered redacted memos, half-shredded documents, notes that suggested years of misconduct. It was not just one officer. It was not just one night. It was a culture of protection, a machine built to shield its own. The town stirred. Some whispered her name with hope, maybe. Finally, someone would break the silence. Others cursed her as an outsider, someone who did not belong, someone stirring trouble where it was not wanted. But whether with hope or with fear, they spoke her name. And that was something Tulare Springs had not seen in years. Meanwhile, Bradley Kean remained untouchable. For 18 years, he had worn the badge. 18 years of traffic stops that escalated without consequence. 18 years of complaints that vanished into lost files. On paper, his record was clean. In truth, he carried the weight of dozens of bruises, of nights spent intimidating young men, of whispered threats left hanging in the air. His power was not loud. It was quiet. insidious, the kind of power that smiles. As it warns, I can make your life harder. And yet, for 18 years, the system protected him. Supervisors looked away. Colleagues remained silent. Victims were silenced. And the machine turned on, day after day, as though nothing was wrong. But with one boy on a bicycle, one leaked video, and one congresswoman who refused to step aside, the machine began to grind to a halt. The silence that had defined Tulare Springs for decades was cracking. The roots of its sickness were being pulled into the light, and from those roots, a trial was born. It would not be just any trial. It would be a trial where Jasmine Crockett would stand as witness, binder of evidence in hand, and face down not just Bradley Kean, but the entire culture that had sheltered him. The people of Tulare Springs would be forced to listen, and the nation, watching from afar, would hear a familiar question rise once again. When truth speaks, will we listen? The first time Jasmine Crockett met the Freeman family in person, the air in their small living room felt thick with both fear and hope. The curtains were drawn, the lights dim, as though the family was still trying to hide from a world that had already invaded their lives. On the couch, Darnell sat quietly, his arm wrapped in a brace, his eyes downcast but attentive. His mother, worn with worry, gripped his hand as though letting go might mean losing him all over again. Jasmine sat across from them, her dark navy suit immaculate, her binder full of papers resting at her side. But in that moment, she was not a congresswoman. She was a listener. She leaned forward, voice low, patient, as Darnell haltingly recounted the night that had changed everything. Each word seemed to weigh heavy in the room. The sound of the bike, tires and gravel, the flash of the police lights, the hand that shoved him to the ground, and finally, the crack of his arm breaking, followed by his own cry for his mother. Jasmine did not interrupt. She let silence carry the story when words faltered. When the boy stopped speaking, she looked at him with a steadiness that seemed to lend him strength. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly, "and your voice matters more than they want you to believe." That night marked the beginning of her journey into Tulare Springs. She could have offered sympathy and walked away, leaving the family to fight a battle they could not possibly win alone. But Crockett had never been the kind of woman who looked away. Her instinct was to act, to investigate, to connect threads. Others tried to cut, and in Tulare Springs, there were plenty of threads waiting to be pulled. She began calling contacts in Dallas and Austin. She asked questions of civil rights lawyers she trusted, men and women who had built cases from scraps of truth before. She reached out to journalists willing to risk the small-town backlash that often came with shining light into dark corners. Piece by piece, she began to build a picture. It did not take long to realize Darnell's story was not unique. There were others. Too many others. Young men stopped for vague traffic violations. Latino workers questioned without reason. Complaints filed and then quietly buried. Families warned to stay silent if they valued their jobs, their homes, their safety. One man, reluctant but tired of carrying the weight, told Jasmine, "I once tried to file a report after Kean shoved me against my own car. The next week my shop was vandalized. No cameras worked that night. Nobody investigated." Another woman whispered that her cousin had been threatened with deportation after questioning an unfair ticket. The stories were not just similar, they were patterns. But patterns alone could not change a system. Jasmine knew that she needed evidence. She needed records, files, documents that would strip away the veil of respectability the department had cloaked itself in for years. And so she started digging deeper. Through contacts in the legal system, she obtained redacted memos that hinted at years of internal investigations, quietly closed with no disciplinary action. She found emails between supervisors that spoke in coded language of maintaining community stability, words that, when read in context, meant ignoring misconduct for the sake of keeping the department's image clean. She spoke to a rookie officer who had left the force within 6 months, disillusioned. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, the young officer said of Kean. But you knew if you crossed him, you'd pay for it. And nobody upstairs wanted to deal with the fallout. Piece by piece, Jasmine built a case not just against one officer, but against an entire system that had learned how to hide its sins. And the more she uncovered, the clearer her role became. She was not simply representing the Freeman family, she was representing every silenced voice in Tulare Springs, every complaint dismissed, every bruise unseen, every whisper that died before it reached the light. Yet even as she worked, resistance grew. Whispers followed her down Main Street. Some residents muttered about outsiders meddling in our town. Others worried quietly, but offered support in hushed tones, away from the gaze of neighbors. The local police union issued a statement defending Officer Kean, calling him a dedicated servant of the community, and all the while, Jasmine continued. She collected testimonies, built timelines, cross-reference files, always moving. With the precision of a woman who knew the stakes, still, there were nights when doubt crept in. Sitting alone in her hotel room, she sometimes asked herself, could one woman truly break a system that had survived by silencing generations? But every time she felt the weight of that question, she remembered Darnell's face, the way he had lowered his eyes while speaking, as though ashamed of being hurt, the way his mother's hands shook while she tried to appear strong, and Jasmine would remind herself, this was not just a case, it was a calling. By the time the Freeman family filed their civil rights lawsuit, Jasmine had uncovered enough to shake the very foundations of Tulare Springs. The lawsuit did not just name Officer Kean, it named the department. It named the city itself. It was a declaration that silence would no longer be tolerated. The courtroom that would hear the case began to fill with anticipation long before the trial started. Locals whispered about what might be revealed. Journalists prepared their pens and cameras, and officers in uniform sat stone-faced, their silence, carrying the weight of years of complicity for Jasmine Crockett. The journey was only beginning. She had walked into Tulare Springs as an outsider, but now she stood at the center of a battle that was bigger than any one town. The question that haunted the air was simple yet profound. Could truth, spoken by one determined woman, break through the fortress of silence that had protected men like Bradley Kean for nearly 2 decades? The answer would come in time, but on that night, as she closed her binder of evidence and prepared to testify, Jasmine knew one thing with certainty. There would be no turning back. Once silence is broken, it cannot be remade. And the people of Tulare Springs, along with the nation watching, were about to learn that lesson. The courthouse in Tulare Springs was not built for history. Its walls had heard property disputes and petty theft, but never the weight of an entire community's silence and shame. On this morning, though, the air was different. The benches filled quickly. The gallery pressed shoulder to shoulder. Some wore stiff collars, as if it were Sunday service. Others came in work boots and weary faces. Everyone came to see whether truth, long buried, would finally be spoken aloud. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped through the doors, the room stilled. She was not a towering figure, but her presence drew every eye. A navisuit, hair pulled neatly back, binder in hand, she looked like a woman who had come not to perform but to testify. Each step of her heels against the tile was deliberate, like a drumbeat, calling the room to order. At the defendant's bench sat Officer Bradley Kean, 18 years in the Tulare Springs Police Department, once called a hero. Now a man accused of breaking the very oath. He swore, his arms were folded, chin raised, eyes locked on Jasmine, as if daring her to speak. He looked unshaken, but his stare carried something darker than confidence. Disdain. Jasmine took the witness stand. She laid her binder down, opened it with careful hands, and lifted her eyes to the judge. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady. Institutional neglect, she said, pausing. That is what we are dealing with here. A culture of silence that punishes those who speak and protects those who harm. The words carried through the chamber like a blade drawn across stone. Reporters leaned forward. Residents shifted uneasily. Even the judge, A man known for stone-faced detachment looked up from his notes. When justice only applies to the comfortable, she continued, turning a page. We do not have law. We have theater. The line cut deep. A woman in the gallery whispered, Amen. A man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Kean's jaw tightened, just for a moment, but Jasmine noticed. Then she began her work. Piece by piece, she laid out what she had uncovered. Statements from residents who spoke of stops that turned threatening, internal memos that showed investigations delayed until they died, body camera failures that curiously occurred only during encounters with Black or Latino youth. Each document was another crack in the wall of silence Tulare Springs had built around itself. But she did not stop with records. She told the stories of Darnell Freeman, 14 years old, crying for his mother, as his arm snapped under Kean's weight. Of Felicia Benavides, who said Kean threatened to deport her cousin after she dared to question a ticket. Of Khalil Green, who found Kean's cruiser outside his store at night, headlights off, a shadow meant to intimidate. Each story added weight. Together they formed not coincidence, but a pattern, one that could no longer be ignored. The gallery shifted. Some leaned in, tears brimming. Others stared down at their shoes, unwilling to meet her gaze. A retired teacher in the back murmured, we all knew. The clerk's hands shook as she tried to write. Even the air seemed heavier. Kean sat still, but his body betrayed him. His foot tapped when Jasmine spoke of his complaints. His grip whitened on the bench edge. When she mentioned missing footage, his lawyer stayed silent, hands folded, as if he too knew words would be useless against what was being revealed. Jasmine pressed on. This is not about one man's bad day, she declared, her gaze sweeping the room. This is about a culture that allows someone to write their own version of the truth again and again, without consequence. The murmur that followed was low but undeniable. People shifted, nodded, or whispered agreement. The truth was too sharp to be swallowed. Then Jasmine reached the passage that would change everything. She lifted the report, written by a former officer, someone who had left the department, but left behind words that burned. She read clearly. Kean often boasted that no one could ever prove a thing. I write the reports, he said. I control the story. What the effect was electric. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge's eyes snapped to Kean. For the first time, silence felt unbearable. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. And Kean broke, his jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, his stare fixed on Jasmine. No longer the cold stillness of control, but the quiver of rage. Barely contained, the mask cracked. Everyone saw it. Jasmine met his eyes. She did not flinch. She had faced men like him before, men who thrived on fear and silence. But here, in this courtroom, she held the power not because of her office, not because of her title, but because truth was on her tongue, and truth no longer bowed. The gallery watched, frozen in suspense. They knew something was about to snap, and what followed in the next 10 seconds would shatter more than silence. It would fracture Tulare Springs and echo across the nation. The tension in the room was unbearable, stretched thin like a wire, ready to snap. Jasmine Crockett's words still echoed. I write the reports. I control the story. She had not raised her voice, yet the effect was louder than thunder. The gallery sat stunned, breaths shallow, eyes flicking between the Congresswoman on the stand and Officer Bradley Kean at the bench. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, the silence shattered. Kean stood. He moved with sudden purpose, his chair scraping back against the wooden floor. For 2 seconds, no one realized what was happening. He took a single step, then another, straight towards Jasmine. His boots struck the floor like a drumbeat of violence. And before anyone could react, before a single guard could move, his hand came up, swift and sharp. The sound of the slap was not deafening. It did not echo against the marble or rattle the windows. It was small, precise, intimate, but the meaning thundered through the room. Jasmine's head snapped slightly to the side. A red handprint bloomed across her cheek. Paper slipped in her grip, but did not fall. For a fraction of a second, the courtroom stopped breathing. The weight of history of every slap meant to silence, every blow meant to humble, filled the chamber. Then chaos. A gasp tore through the gallery, high and sharp, echoing like a wail. The prosecutor's pen rolled unnoticed across the floor. 2 court officers lunged from opposite sides. The judge's gavel struck once, twice, 3 times, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Get him out of my courtroom." But Kean did not resist. That was the part that made it eerie. He did not struggle, did not fight. He simply stood, hands sliding behind his back, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. His face was cold, his eyes empty, his jaw set tight. Hands. One officer barked, but Kean had already offered them. He let the cuffs click around his wrists like he was surrendering to inevitability. For years he had acted untouchable. Now he looked almost relieved. Jasmine did not cry. She did not crumble. Slowly, she turned her head back, eyes locking onto Kean as they pulled him away. For just an instant, something flickered across her face, not only anger, but something else, something harder to name. Pity, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it came. A woman in a tan suit leapt from the front row, shouting, "That's assault. That's assault in a courtroom. Is this what justice looks like now?" Reporters scrambled, phones out, some already live streaming, despite the courtroom's strict rules. The words, "She's a member of Congress," ricocheted through the air. But it wasn't her title that shook the room. It was the raw truth. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. The irony cut deep. Kean was not on trial for theft or corruption. He was there because of civil rights violations, because he had brutalized a black child on the side of the road. And now, in full view of the law, with the whole country watching, he had struck a black congresswoman mid-testimony. The gallery buzzed with disbelief. Yet in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett stood tall. She stepped down from the witness stand slowly, her cheeks still marked. Her expression unreadable. A court officer rushed toward her, hand out to guide her to safety. She shook her head firmly. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady but low, a quiet defiance that carried across the room. "We finish what we came here to do." The judge looked torn, his gavel still clutched in his hand. "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm fine." She cut in. "He doesn't get to silence me." And in that instant, the room hushed again, not from fear, but from awe. For a second time, silence reigned. This time, not because people were stunned, but because they were moved. It was the silence of admiration, of shame, of understanding that something larger than them had just unfolded. The reporters knew they had their headline. They tapped furiously at their phones. "Assault in courtroom C1. Officer Kean snaps. Congresswoman struck during testimony." The cameras might not have been allowed inside, but every witness carried the image in their memory, etched with perfect clarity. The bailiff whispered something to the judge, who nodded slowly, his face pale. Finally, he struck the gavel again and declared, "This court is now in recess." 10 minutes, but no one moved. They sat frozen, watching Jasmine. She adjusted her blazer, blinked once, and walked calmly into the hallway outside. People poured into the corridor with her, phones already pressed to ears, voices trembling as they tried to explain what they had seen. It was like a dream. One woman muttered, "Like something you haven't woken up from yet." An older officer, white-haired, approached Jasmine quietly. His voice was graveled, thick with shame. "Ma'am," he said, "what he did back there. I'm ashamed to wear the same uniform." She gave him a small nod. No words, only acknowledgement. Nearby, a teenage girl, likely an intern, dressed in borrowed heels, stared at Jasmine like she was witnessing history. For her, this was not just a courtroom scene. It was a story she would one day tell her grandchildren, because in truth, this was not the beginning. It was not even the whole of the story. It was the moment when years of buried truth, whispered fear, and institutional silence finally broke open for the world to see. Inside the chamber, Kean was led away in handcuffs, his badge and sidearm taken as evidence. He didn't struggle, didn't plead, didn't look back. His eyes scanned the room as though still searching for someone to blame, but he found no allies now. The blue wall of silence had cracked, and outside the courthouse, the news was already spreading like wildfire. Before the sun set, every network in the nation would replay the story, the slap, the silence, the defiance. In less than a day, it would become more than a courtroom scandal. It would become a symbol, because Kean hadn't just struck Jasmine Crockett, he had struck at the very heart of justice. And justice, at last, was striking back. News does not always move fast in America's small towns. But in the age of shaky phone cameras and restless thumbs, one moment can leap from the courtroom floor to the entire world in the span of a heartbeat. By nightfall, the slap heard in Tulare Springs had already ignited a blaze far bigger than any gavel or guard could contain. There were no official cameras in Courtroom C. One, but there did not need to be. A grainy 14-second clip, captured on a hidden phone, spread like wildfire across social media. It showed only fragments. Kean stepping forward, Jasmine standing firm, the sharp motion of his arm, the recoil of her face. The sound was muffled, but the image was unmistakable. Congresswoman assaulted during testimony. The words raced across the bottom of every major news broadcast that evening. Anchors who usually spoke with cool detachment stumbled over their lines. Civil rights lawyers were booked for late-night panels. Former judges admitted they had never seen anything like it. And outside the television studios, the people moved. In Oakland, candles flickered in the hands of more than 600 protesters. They held signs that bore Jasmine Crockett's face alongside that of 14-year-old Darnell Freeman. The images were raw, her bruised cheek, his broken arm. Together they told a story older than either of them, the story of what happens when silence shields violence. In Chicago, dozens gathered in the cold outside a federal courthouse, chanting into the night. In Atlanta, students marched down Peachtree Street with banners reading "Justice for Jasmine, Justice for Darnell." In Houston, the Freeman family's name was spoken by people who had never met them, their pain adopted as a symbol of something larger. The hashtags trended worldwide. Justice for Jasmine. Kean in cuffs. This was not just a local scandal anymore. It was a lit match, thrown into a room, already soaked with gasoline, the accumulated anger of generations who had seen too much and borne too much in silence. The president issued a careful statement. We must protect the dignity of our courts and those who seek justice within them. It was measured, almost clinical, but for many, it was not enough. They were waiting for something stronger, a thunderous rejection of what had happened in that small Texas town. The loudest voice, however, came from Jasmine herself. Less than 48 hours after the assault, she stood on the steps of the United States Capitol. Her cheek still carried a faint bruise, but she wore no makeup to hide it. Her blazer was gray, her posture straight, and when she began to speak, her voice was steel. I did not get struck because I told a lie, she said. I got struck because I told the truth that some people did not want to hear. The words rang out across the steps, carried on the wind, caught by every microphone, and camera pointed her way. She paused, letting the silence swell. Officer Kean did not just strike me, she continued. He struck every person who ever tried to hold power accountable and paid the price for it. He struck every family who buried their truth because they feared no one would believe them. But we are done playing by rules that only protect the people who write them. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, chants of her name. For a moment, it felt like the steps themselves vibrated with the sound. That night, her words echoed far beyond Washington. They were repeated on talk shows, quoted in sermons, pasted across protest placards. They became part of the nation's vocabulary of defiance. In Tulare Springs, the police union scrambled. A spokesperson, visibly shaken, announced that Kean had been placed on unpaid leave. They avoided the word fired, clinging to language that sounded less final. But the world was not buying it. Not anymore. In local diners, the mood was fractured. Some residents defended Jasmine, saying she had brought light to truths they had long whispered about. Others muttered that outsiders were stirring up trouble, their words tinged with fear that the silence they had relied on could no longer protect them. But even those who wished to look away could not deny the world's gaze, now fixed on their town, and at the center of it all was Darnell Freeman. The boy who had once tried to avoid reporters now found himself a symbol. One photograph in particular circled the globe, a still image of Darnell holding Jasmine's hand as they left the courthouse together. No words, just connection. In a later interview, his voice quiet but steady, Darnell said, "She came here to speak for me, but she also showed me I can speak for myself." It was a sentence that shook people more than any headline. For every parent who had told their child to stay silent out of fear, for every elder who had chosen survival over confrontation, those words landed like a stone in still water. The ripples spread. Not all voices were supportive. Certain television networks invited former officers to defend Kean, to suggest Jasmine had provoked him, but the backlash was swift and fierce. That narrative, the old, tired blame of the victim, no longer held sway in a world with too many videos, too many names, too many graves. Letters and messages poured into Jasmine's office. Some were filled with hate, dripping with the venom of those who feared her strength, but most carried hope. Handwritten notes from church ladies in Ohio, flowers from community groups in Mississippi, emails from young activists who said her stand gave them courage, survivors of police brutality who said, "When you stood there, you stood for me." And then came a voice no one expected. On a national broadcast, Ray Winston, Kean's former partner who had retired 2 years earlier, broke his silence. His face was lined, his voice weary, but his words were clear. "I should have spoken up," he admitted. "I saw what he did to Darnell. I saw what he did to others. And we stayed quiet because we thought the system would protect us, but now it's broken. And maybe that's a good thing." His voice cracked. The studio sat in silence. Across living rooms and phone screens, people listened. For the first time, an officer from Tulare Springs had said aloud what so many already knew. Silence had been the accomplice, and so the firestorm raged. Protests spread. Investigations were demanded, and the Department of Justice announced a preliminary review of the Tulare Springs Police Department. But beneath the headlines and the noise, something quieter had shifted. In kitchens, in classrooms, in barbershops and churches, people were talking about it. Not just about the slap, but about what it revealed about the cost of silence and the power of truth spoken aloud. For the first time in decades, Tulare Springs was no longer a town that could hide its shame. The world had seen, the nation had answered, and the question now was not whether the fire would burn, but how far its light would reach. 3 weeks after the courtroom assault, Bradley Kean returned to court, but this time not as an officer in uniform. He entered, chained at the wrists, wearing the coarse orange of a county jumpsuit. His hair was unkempt, his jaw still tight, but the badge that had shielded him for 18 years was gone. No sidearm, no uniform, no shield. The man once called protector of Tulare Springs was now simply defendant. The courtroom looked different this time. It was not the small hearing room where Jasmine had been struck. This was a larger chamber, packed wall to wall with press, federal prosecutors, and a public whose patience with silence had run out. Camera crews waited outside, their lenses trained on every door. Inside, the air vibrated with anticipation. The charges read like a lifetime of reckoning: felony assault, obstruction of justice, and violating the civil rights of a federal official. For years, complaints had disappeared into filing cabinets. Now they were resurrected, laid bare under the harsh light of federal scrutiny. The prosecutor wasted no time. Her opening words cut through the chamber like steel. "We are not here today to prosecute a slap," she declared. "We are here to prosecute the belief that violence can silence accountability, that an officer's badge is a shield against truth. That power excuses brutality. Today, we prove that it does not." Kean's defense lawyer shifted uncomfortably, as though the ground had already begun to slip, and in the third row sat Jasmine Crockett. She wore no makeup to cover the fading bruise on her cheek. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her very presence was testimony. The witnesses came, one by one. Some were expected civil rights experts, community leaders, and members of the Freeman family. Darnell himself, his arm still healing, spoke softly into the microphone. "I didn't do anything," he repeated. "He threw me down anyway." His words, the same ones captured on the leaked footage, now resounded in the chamber where justice could no longer look away. But what shook the room most were the voices from within Kean's own ranks. Two officers, both retired, both visibly weary, broke the code of silence. They spoke of nights when Kean lost his temper, when he slammed civilians against cars for talking back, when he tampered with cameras to hide excessive force. One described how Kean boasted about writing reports to make his version of events unchallengeable. For years, these men had said nothing. Fear had bound their tongues. But now, with the nation watching, they chose to speak. The blue wall of silence, that invisible barrier of loyalty that so often smothered truth, cracked before the eyes of the jury. Kean sat expressionless. No clenched jaw this time. No smirk. Just a man stripped of the myth of invincibility. The defense attempted its strategy, painting Kean as a man, pushed to his limits, provoked, misunderstood. But the weight of evidence was too heavy. The footage of Darnell, the testimony of Jasmine, the accounts of fellow officers, piece by piece, the shield crumbled. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. "On all charges, we find the defendant guilty." The word hung in the air, guilty. For a moment, silence. Then a collective exhale rippled through the room, as if the nation itself had been holding its breath. Kean was led away in shackles, his eyes fixed on the floor. No triumphant smirk, no final stare at Jasmine. Just a man who had built his power on silence, now swallowed by it. Outside, the scene was electric. Reporters shouted into microphones. Protesters cheered, their chants echoing against the courthouse walls. One sign read, "Power isn't untouchable. Justice is." For the Freeman family, it was a vindication. Darnell, once a boy afraid to raise his voice, stood taller beside his mother. Their lawyer, Kendrick Mosley, told reporters this case was never just about a teenager. It was about a system. And today, the system answered back. The Department of Justice wasted no time. Within weeks, it launched a full investigation into the Tulare Springs Police Department. Patterns of racial profiling, missing evidence, and intimidation were uncovered. 5 officers resigned. 2 captains were placed on leave. An entirely new oversight board, made up of local citizens, was established for the first time in decades. Tulare Springs had to face itself. But even as reforms began, Jasmine reminded the public that justice was not complete. A guilty verdict is not the end. She said, "It is the beginning. Because accountability cannot be an event, it must be a culture." Kean's sentencing came 4 months later. The judge did not mince words. 18 years. You wore a badge. He said, 18 years the community trusted you to protect them. Instead, you betrayed that trust. You weaponized it. And now, you will face the consequence. 8 years in federal prison. No parole for at least 5. It was not the length of the sentence that mattered most, but the weight of the message. A uniform no longer guaranteed impunity. When Jasmine left the courthouse that day, the press crowded her as always. Do you feel vindicated? One reporter shouted. She paused, her gaze steady. This was never about me, she said. It was about what happens when we stop pretending the system works. The same for everyone. It was about a boy named Darnell who deserved to ride his bike home without fear. It was about a town that deserved honesty, and it was about a country that deserves accountability. Her words rippled outward, replayed on screens, written into editorials, quoted in sermons. For some, it was a relief. For others, a reckoning. But for all, it was undeniable. The silence that had shielded Kean for 18 years was broken. And for Tulare Springs, for America, there was no turning back. In Tulare Springs, the story of a slap was never really about the sound it made. It was about the silence. It broke when Officer Bradley Kean raised his hand against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He did more than commit an assault. He revealed the sickness of a system that had protected him for nearly 2 decades. He showed the world what silence looks like when it festers too long. Silence in the police department, silence in the town, silence in the nation. But silence did not win. From that single moment in Courtroom C1, a chain reaction spread across America. It carried into streets where candles burned for justice, into classrooms where teachers rewrote their lessons, into living rooms where parents reminded their children that their voices mattered. It carried into the halls of Congress, where legislation was drafted to bring oversight to small-town police departments, and it carried into the very soul of Tulare Springs, where neighbors who once looked away began to stand up and speak. For Jasmine Crockett, the assault was never the story's end. She refused to be defined as a victim. Her words on the Capitol steps became a rallying cry. I was not struck because I lied. I was struck because I told the truth. Those words will be remembered long after the bruise on her cheek has faded. For Darnell Freeman, the boy whose cry for his mother had first sparked attention, the reckoning meant something more personal. He found his voice. He no longer saw himself as a helpless teenager, crushed by the weight of a badge. He began speaking at youth gatherings, reminding others that they too could stand. I used to think if you spoke up, they'd come for you, he told Jasmine once, but maybe they come for you either way, so you might as well speak. Those words, simple and raw, captured the truth of this story. The conviction of Bradley Kean, the federal oversight of Tulare Springs Police Department, the resignations and reforms. These were victories, but the deeper victory was cultural. It was the shift from silence to speech, from fear to courage, from resignation to resistance. And that is why this story matters. Not only for Tulare Springs, not only for Texas, but for every community where silence has been a shield for injustice, because injustice thrives in shadows. It survives on hesitation, on the fear that no one will listen, on the lie that speaking out will change nothing. But Jasmine Crockett showed what happens when one person refuses to be silenced. She carried the truth into the open. And once the truth was spoken, it could not be hidden again. Months later, when the headlines had moved on and the cameras had turned elsewhere, the echoes of that courtroom moment still lingered. They lived in the new oversight boards holding police accountable. They lived in the students who taped Jasmine's words to their lockers. They lived in the communities that organized voter drives and town hall meetings for the first time in decades. And they lived in the simple understanding that silence protects no one. That is the lesson we are left with. Not the slap, not the gavel, not even the verdict, but the reminder that courage is contagious and silence can be broken. If you have listened this far, carry this story with you. Tell it to your children. Share it with your neighbors. Repeat it in your churches, your schools, your community centers, because truth only survives if we refuse to bury it. Justice is not a moment. It is not a verdict. It is not a headline. Justice is a culture built day by day, word by word, choice by choice. And it begins when ordinary people, elders, mothers, sons, daughters, decide to no longer keep quiet. So remember Tulare Springs. Remember Darnell Freeman. Remember Jasmine Crockett, standing in that courtroom, head unbowed, voice unbroken. saying, "He does not get to silence me." Let those words echo wherever silence still lingers. Because truth is stronger than fear. Because justice is louder than silence. And because the story does not end here, it begins again every time someone chooses to speak.